And this happened a long time ago, back when I was a kid, whenever my mom and dad would be busy going to work. They would leave me and my younger cousin to my grandma. All things were fine and all, but one day I decided to go to the river at the back of my grandma's house. So I got up and took my younger cousin with me. It was normal at first. We'd go there almost every time, even when the elders would say, "Don't go there. There are bad spirits and people that died there." I brushed it off as just an old wives' tale, until one day when we went to the river. And that day was cloudy, and the water was murky. But we stayed nonetheless until one of the elders grabbed us and said, "You shouldn't be here when the water is this strong." So she took our hands and started to go back, but before we did, I looked back and I saw it, that thing. It was so clear in my head, I can never forget what I saw. A woman in all white. Her clothes were dirty and scratched, and the opening skin was just oozing dark liquid. It still shocks me to this day. Fast forward a few years, and news came out. One night, while my uncle was staying with my grandma, they claimed that that very night something supernatural happened. The smell of dead fish covered the whole room, while parts of the ceiling started to drip blood all the while. Their hairs were as straight as a tree. They were freaked out by this, so a few days later our parents came to see them. I saw my cousin and I proposed we investigate the place at night around 7 p.m. to be exact. Thinking back to my old experience, I told my 12-year-old self I could handle whatever happens. So when 7 p.m. struck, we armed ourselves with a flashlight for the both of us. Naturally, my cousin being the coward he is, I gave him a simple task to go to the back side of the kitchen and look around while I went to the far back of the house and tried to find something unusual. As I arrived at the back of the house, I asked in a slight high-pitched voice, "Is anyone there?" Nothing. As I was about to turn back, it breathed. The sound of something so big was right behind me. It breathed so heavily, I ran and didn't dare look back, and yelled for my younger cousin to go back into the house. As we went back in, I explained the story to them. But for some reason, I don't think they believe me. Now, you might think it might be, but I swear what I heard that day wasn't a figment of my imagination. Now, just last year, I stayed at my grandma's house with my 2 older sisters and my mom. Since her and my dad got divorced, though, I still stay with my dad. I asked my mom and grandma if anyone died in the river. They said yes. According to them, there were about 3 women who died in the river. All of them died by the strong currents of the water. As I asked the townsfolk, some of them have had the same experiences as me. A woman in the river, all white clothing and bruised. While my father said before he arrived at the place, there was actually a cult in the river. Now, there was a lot of odd stuff that happened, but I'm not going to get into the details. All I want to know is, what is she, and why is she there? A couple of weeks ago, I received word from my mother, while I was on the phone with her, that the family friend that the property had been sold to reached out to my father in an attempt to see if he would be interested in repurchasing it. She explained that Dad still has an attachment to the property, as it was the only thing left to him after his parents died. The rest of his siblings got money, and he no longer has it. His siblings have always been rather critical of the fact that the property was demolished and sold, despite the fact that none of them wanted it over the money. As such, the friend agreed to contact Dad first if they ever had an interest in selling it. To make a long story short, the activity does not appear to have ceased with the demolition of the house. Rather, it has simply moved to the other functional buildings that were on the property. I did not mention this in the original story, but there were a variety of smaller buildings that dotted that property. They included a chicken house, a garage/warehouse, a cattle building, a milk house. I have no idea what the original function of this building was, as we never used it. This was the label we gave it. And a partially dilapidated building that sat adjacent to the house. The dilapidated building, as well as the house itself, were demolished completely. The remaining buildings were left standing as this friend intended the property to be used as an additional farm. Since acquiring the property, the friend described 4 issues to my father that have created their desire to sell. The first is they are having an issue with lights that are randomly turning off and on, thereby driving their electricity bills up, as the only thing that even lives on the property is livestock. They got smart and attempted to address the problem by removing light bulbs from the troubled buildings, but found that lights would simply turn on at other properties. And the second issue is the livestock are getting loose without being let out by our family friend. They have installed electric fences, gates, and chain link fencing in an attempt to keep their livestock contained on the property. Unfortunately, the gates are being left open, and the animals are simply getting out and running amok. They attempted to address the problem by tying rope to secure the gate, but would just find the knots untied after getting a call about the animals going into the road. The only thing that appears to have lessened the issue is the installation of locks on these gates. And the third issue is that they have converted what used to be our garage into a warehouse for holding tractors and other agricultural equipment, as well as a tool workshop. Regardless of the time of day, they stated that they have heard footsteps walking on the wooden rafters of the warehouse, as well as hearing knocking sounds on the doors and walls. It's gotten to a point where they no longer feel comfortable working there after an incident in which they left the warehouse to grab some items from their truck and returned to find that the deadbolt had been engaged on the door they had walked out of. No one else was there. And the final issue is the big one: 911 calls. A couple of years ago, they stated they were visited by the county sheriff's office to discuss the fact that 911 calls are pinging out of the property. There is no one on the other end of the line, and the calls will just sit there if permitted to. Much like us, they had an issue with break-ins because the property is not actively lived on, so they simply assumed that the only working phone on the property had been triggered somehow after the break-ins. They uninstalled the phone, but the calls are still happening, and the problem has gotten serious enough that the county started sending him bills for the bogus calls because the sheriff's office is responding and finding nothing and no one on the property but the animals. Since they service an entire county, they are getting frustrated responding to the considerable distance it takes to get to that location just to find no issue. The property is effectively a business for them now, and they are eating a loss on their revenue because of the bills associated with these calls. At this point, that family friend is willing to sell the property back to Dad at the same price that they had purchased it nearly 10 years ago. If Dad elects not to purchase it, they intend to sell it, as is, to someone else as soon as possible. If somebody wants it, be on the lookout for a considerable plot of land with only functional buildings on it in the area of central Indiana, with a price that seems to be too good to be true. And this happened back in 1999, before cell phones even had cameras. My dad and I went to see his uncle up in the country. This was in the Philippines, by the way. Now, his uncle wasn't a healer, witch doctor, or whatever term you want to call it. This wasn't the first time we were going there. And I've been present during his healing sessions before, but this trip will forever be seared into my memories for as long as I live. We were on our second day there, BSing with my dad's uncle and cousins over some drinks. I wasn't drinking because my dad wouldn't let me drink yet since I was barely 19 at the time. So I was having a Coke with some ice. My dad's uncle wasn't drinking that day as well because he said he was expecting a patient. The said patient arrived with her parents at around 3 p.m. Now, this girl was maybe 16 or 17, slim and petite, and was a real looker. Kinda looked like Maggie Q, now that I think about it. My dad's uncle ushered them inside, leaving us on the front porch. About an hour later, my dad's uncle called us inside. He told us to change into white t-shirts. I didn't have one, so my uncle, one of my dad's cousins, lent me one. I didn't know what was happening, but apparently my dad knew what was going on, because he gave me a look that said, "Ask your questions later." The patient and her parents were inside the room my dad's uncle used during the healing sessions, and before he ushered us in, he uttered some phrases in a language I do not know, and rubbed some oil into our eyelids, ears, scalp, and cheeks. It smelled like coconut oil, with something else mixed with it. We entered the room to see the girl dressed in a white, ankle-length dress, lying on a low bamboo bed with her parents on either side of her. She had her eyes closed, and at first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but something changed with her. I looked at her face and I saw it. She looked old. Not old, but she looked 20 years older. She looked like somebody else. And there was a porcelain pot by the foot of the bed. And when I looked in it, it was filled with centipedes. And they were wet with some kind of, well, something. My dad's uncle asked us to each take a limb and hold on tight. I grabbed one of her wrists gently at first because she was so slight I was afraid I would break her wrist. But her father told me to grip her tighter. So I did, with both hands. When we each had a wrist and ankle secure, my dad's uncle started to mutter under his breath, while rubbing oil on the girl's forehead. The parents stepped aside and moved to the foot of the bed. My dad's uncle took some branches with leaves, dipped them in oil, and started sprinkling the girl with them. The girl let out this long, low growl. I may have let out a girly scream. I may have not. But at this point, I was so scared that I had a death grip on her wrists. She started thrashing around. All the while, my dad's uncle was speaking to her in another language. I tried my best to keep her arm pinned to the bed, but it felt really strange, like she was on a raft. I looked down, and well, the bed was half a foot off the ground. I was so surprised, and I lost concentration. The girl shook herself free of my grip and smacked me across the face so hard I was knocked out. Even after this was relayed to me by my dad when I came to on a sofa in the living room. The girl's father took my place. The girl started talking back to my dad's uncle in a different language. According to my dad, this went on for quite a bit, with the girl even laughing a couple of times. My dad's uncle then took a length of black sewing thread, dipped it in oil, and laid it across the girl's throat. The girl started choking and turned blue and stopped breathing. The parents understandably panicked. My dad's uncle told them to wait, and sure enough, the girl gasped and opened her eyes and started crying. It turns out the girl was cursed by a barang, hired by a scorned suitor. A barang in the Philippines is something worse than a witch. The centipedes inside the pot, They came crawling out of her vagina during the first hour we weren't in the room with them. A few days later, word got out to us that another healer a few towns over died the same night. The girl was brought to my dad's uncle. He died of strangulation. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please give a like, leave a comment, and subscribe. Perhaps click the bell for notifications, and remember, hell is empty, and the devils are here.